A memo sits in the National Archives. White House letterhead. Presidential seal at top. Dated November 12, 1963. Subject line reads, Request for declassification of historical architectural survey data. The signature at bottom, John F. Kennedy, 10 days before Dallas. This is why JFK wanted files on buildings that were not supposed to exist and why that request never got answered. The memo requests declassification of architectural surveys conducted 1888 through 1891, federal buildings, municipal structures, courthouses, post offices, customs houses, all constructed before 1880. The request specifies urgent, cites public interest. References need for historical research and engineering study. Request timeline for document release. The list attached spans 4 pages, not addresses. Geographic coordinates. Latitude and longitude for structures across former territories, 847 locations, 12 states, 4 countries, every single entry, construction date before 1880, every single one government property, every single one still standing, still in use, still generating questions no official will address. Response memo dated November 18, 1963, 4 days before Dallas. Stamped classified. Access denied. Reasoning redacted. Black bars where explanation should be. Just 3 words visible. National security grounds. A sitting president requested access to surveys of buildings constructed 80 years earlier. Buildings citizens walked through daily. Buildings that housed post offices and courts and government offices. Someone told him no. 4 days later, Dallas happened. The declassification request? Filed away. Stamped restricted. Never addressed again. Why did a president about to deliver a speech in Texas spend his final weeks requesting century-old building surveys? The files do not say. They just show he asked. And someone denied him access to documents about buildings Americans used every day. If you have walked through old government buildings and felt something different, if the air changed or sound behaved strangely, or temperature dropped in ways that felt wrong, subscribe. You will want to see what these documents reveal about structures you have been inside. I was not researching presidents, I was cataloging National Archives architectural records, building surveys, structural assessments, historic preservation documentation, routine work, boxes of paper describing construction methods and material specifications and engineering reports from the 1800s, standard historical documentation. I found a folder marked Executive Office Requests, 1963, Expected Construction Project Approvals, Renovation Permits, Historic Designation Requests. The first document stopped me. Memorandum from the President. November 12. Presidential seal at top. Subject line about declassification. Architectural surveys from 1888. I kept reading. The request was specific, not just access, full declassification. Make the surveys public, available to researchers, available to historians, available to engineers who wanted to study what those buildings were designed to do. Then the response memo. November 18. 4 days before Dallas. Access denied. Files remain classified. Presidential request noted but not honored. By the third document, I realized something felt wrong. This was not about historic preservation, not about documenting construction methods. The surveys he wanted declassified measured properties, architectural properties buildings were not designed to have. The denial came from Interior Department, from Public Buildings Service, from officials who managed the very buildings the surveys documented. They told a president no. They kept surveys classified that documented measurements of federal property Americans walked through daily. I started pulling files. What was measured in 1888 that remained restricted in 1963? What could be in building surveys that a sitting president could not access? The trail led to National Archives of 2, College Park, Maryland. Record Group 64, Public Buildings Service, Box 47. Architectural Surveys 1880, 8 through 1891. Started there. The pattern emerged within 3 folders. Washington, D.C. July 1888. Heat makes marble steps shimmer like water. Inside the Treasury Building, 3rd floor, engineers unpack wooden crates. Equipment emerges. Heavy instruments. Brass fittings. Glass-encased meters with needle dials. Standard structural survey equipment would be plumb lines measuring tapes, theodolites for checking foundation settlement, tools for assessing cracks, checking wall plumb, measuring load distribution. That is not what comes out of these crates. Voltmeters, electromagnetic field detectors, Instruments more common in electrical laboratories than architectural surveys. Equipment for measuring potential difference, for detecting current, for mapping field strength around conductors. This is 1888. Reliable electrical generation barely existed. Edison Pearl Street Station had opened 6 years earlier. Most buildings had no electricity, no wiring, no electrical systems of any kind. Yet here were engineers setting up electrical measurement equipment to survey a building constructed in 1836, 52 years before electrical systems became common in federal buildings. The Survey Commission had been established June 1888 by Interior Department order. Official purpose stated clearly: structural assessment of federal buildings constructed between 1840 and 1880, standard engineering evaluation, check for foundation issues, document any structural concerns, preserve historic properties. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual, except the equipment was wrong. The methodology documents show what they actually did. Not measuring walls for cracks, not checking foundations for settlement, they were testing for voltage between building elements and earth ground. Day fast Bay test round. They were mapping electromagnetic field patterns around copper architectural features. They were measuring something buildings should not have. 23 buildings tested across Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, all federal property, all constructed before 1880, all containing significant copper architectural elements, domes, roof structures, decorative features, drainage systems. The engineers ran tests over weeks, systematic, methodical. They placed instruments at copper building elements, connected ground leads to earth stakes driven into soil, measured potential difference, then recorded what the meters showed. Treasury Building, 8.3 volts between copper dome structure and foundation ground. Measured July 14th. Repeated July 17th, 8.4 volts. Repeated July 21st, 8.2 volts. Post Office Building, 7.9 volts. Patent Office, 8.7 volts. Customs House, 7.6 volts. Measurable electrical potential. Sustained. Repeatable. Present in buildings constructed decades before electrical systems existed. The Commission tested control buildings for comparison. Structures built after 1880 using modern construction methods. Treasury Annex completed 1881. Post Office expansion finished 1883. Same materials, same copper elements, same installation methods documented in engineering specifications. Voltage measured, 0. No potential difference. No field patterns, standard results. What should happen when you test inert building materials? But buildings constructed before 1880, using supposedly inferior methods and less refined materials, showed consistent electrical properties Victorian engineering manuals never described. When I found those measurement logs in the archives, I stopped reading. Stared at the numbers for several minutes. These were not structural assessments. These were electrical surveys of buildings constructed before reliable electrical generation existed, showing measurable voltage that should not be there. The logs continue for pages, building after building, date after date. The readings vary slightly but stay consistent. Treasury stays around 8 volts. Patent Office stays around 8.5. Post Office stays around 7.8. Over 6 weeks of testing, the potential does not fade, does not diminish, does not behave like residual charge dissipating over time. It just stays measurable, repeatable, present. The Commission submitted its report August 1888, filed with Interior Department, documented all measurements, listed all buildings tested, presented all data collected over 6 weeks. The report was classified October 1888, 2 months after submission. Immediate restriction, no public announcement, no explanation, just stamped classified and filed away. The engineers who conducted the surveys, reassigned to different projects, disbanded, sent to work on routine structural assessments in different cities. The measurements they documented, never explained. The phenomenon they recorded, never investigated further. The properties they found in pre-1880 buildings, never mentioned in any public engineering literature. The buildings still stand. Citizens still walk through them. The copper elements remain in place, and the surveys explaining what those elements do. Classified for 75 years. Cambridge, Massachusetts. October 1963. MIT Electrical Engineering Laboratory. Afternoon light through tall windows, equipment humming, oscilloscopes displaying waveforms. Graduate students were supposed to be studying acoustic properties of spaces, reverberation time, sound absorption, echo patterns in different architectural volumes. Standard acoustics research, thesis material, nothing unusual. 3 students had spent summer measuring historic buildings around Boston, churches, libraries, government buildings constructed in the 1800s, recording how sound behaved in those spaces, comparing old construction to modern, routine research, expected results, except they found something unexpected. One student was setting up microphones in Boston Federal Courthouse. Building completed 1872, classical revival architecture, copper dome. Granite and limestone construction. She was measuring reverberation time in the main hall. Her equipment started showing interference, noise in the recordings that should not be there. She checked connections, tested cables, replaced microphones. Interference continued. She borrowed an electromagnetic field detector from the physics lab. Standard troubleshooting. Eliminate electrical interference before acoustic testing. The detector registered field patterns near the copper dome structure, not interference from power lines, not ambient radiation from building systems. Localized field patterns around specific architectural elements. She mentioned it to her advisor, showed him the detector readings. He was curious, brought 2 other professors to measure it. They verified the readings, detected electromagnetic fields near copper building elements that should not generate fields. The professors became interested. This was 1872 construction. No electrical systems when built. Modern electrical retrofitting was isolated, grounded, shielded, should not create field patterns around century-old copper architecture. They designed a more comprehensive study. Not just one building. Not just Boston. Survey federal buildings across multiple states. 200 buildings constructed before 1880. Test for electromagnetic properties. Measure field strength. Document patterns. Determine if this was isolated anomaly or systematic phenomenon. Research proposal submitted to White House October 23, 1963, required presidential authorization for federal building access, needed funding for equipment and travel, requested permission to conduct non-destructive testing at 18 buildings for initial phase. Proposal was thorough, 37 pages, detailed methodology, expected outcomes, scientific significance. Budget breakdown, timeline showing testing could begin December 1963, everything necessary for research approval. JAT reviewed the proposal, approved it November 4, 1963, signed authorization memo, allocated funding, designated 18 buildings for initial testing, federal courthouses, post offices, customs houses, all constructed before 1880, all containing significant copper architectural elements. Everything was set. Funding approved, buildings cleared for access, testing scheduled to begin first week of December. When I found that approval memo sitting in the file, presidential signature at bottom, authorization granted, funding cleared, testing approved, I thought research must have proceeded. Everything was in order. President had signed off. MIT engineers had clearance. Then November 22 happened. Dallas, December 3, 1963, 11 days after assassination. The MIT study was canceled. Telephone calls from Interior Department to MIT, research no longer authorized, funding rescinded, building access permissions revoked, testing canceled. The professors were contacted directly, told the research program was terminated, no explanation provided, just terminated. The graduate students who made initial discoveries, reassigned to different thesis projects, encouraged to pursue other topics. The proposal that JFK approved, reclassified, filed away, marked restricted. Presidential approval should mean research proceeds. President authorizes study. Funding allocated. Buildings cleared for access. Scientists ready to begin. Everything approved through proper channels. Then president dies. New administration takes over. Research immediately terminated. Approval revoked. Scientists blocked from conducting study their president had authorized 3 weeks before his death. The building still stood. The copper elements remained in place. The electromagnetic properties the students detected were still there. Measurable, repeatable, present in century-old architecture. But the research to document and explain those properties stopped before it began. The question became not what would the study have found. The question became, why was presidential authorization insufficient to protect research from cancellation? Why did officials move so quickly to terminate study that sitting president had personally approved? What was in century-old buildings that could not be studied even with presidential backing? White House Executive Office Building, November 12, 1963. Morning light through tall windows. A typewriter clicking. Secretary preparing memorandum on presidential letterhead. Standard procedure when a president wants documents declassified. The authority is clear, unambiguous. Executive Order 10501 establishes presidential control over classification system. Presidents can classify information. Presidents can declassify information. The authority flows from the office itself. Declassification happens routinely. Historic documents reach certain age. Public interest increases. Security concerns fade. National Archives requests review. President authorizes release. Standard process. Happens regularly without controversy. That is how it should work. The memo being typed is specific. Subject line reads, Request for declassification of historical architectural survey data, Federal Buildings Survey Commission 1888 through 1891. The text explains reasoning. MIT engineers submitted research proposal requesting access to federal buildings for electromagnetic property testing. Initial student findings suggest architectural anomalies worth investigating. Comprehensive study would benefit from historical context. Survey data from 1880s would provide that context. Request continues. Make surveys publicly available. Release to National Archives for researcher access. Declassify measurement data, methodology documentation, building lists, all findings. Remove restrictions. Allow historians and engineers to examine what federal buildings were designed to do. Memo cites public interest in understanding historic federal architecture. Notes buildings remain in use serving American citizens daily. States no apparent security concern in releasing 80-year-old structural surveys. Timeline requested. How long for review process? How long for declassification? When can documents be made available to MIT researchers and other interested parties? The memo goes to Interior Secretary, to Director of Public Buildings Service, to Archivist of the United States, all officials who manage federal property and historic documentation, standard routing, proper channels. Presidential request through appropriate bureaucratic structure. Responses arrive over next 6 days. November 15, 1963. Interior Secretary responds first. Memorandum marked confidential. Addressed to President Kennedy. Text is brief. Recommends continued classification of architectural survey data from 1888 through 1891 period. Cites national security grounds. No elaboration, no explanation of what security concern 80-year-old building surveys could pose. Just recommendation to deny declassification request. November 16, Public Buildings Service Director responds. Also recommends maintaining classification. Supports Interior Secretary position. Provides no additional justification. No detail about what information needs protection. Just states surveys should remain restricted. November 17. Archivist responds last. Memo acknowledges presidential authority to declassify materials. Notes Executive Order 10501 gives President final say on classification decisions. Then states preference to defer to Interior Department judgment on this matter. Recommends following their guidance. 3 agencies, 3 responses, all recommend denial. November 18, 1963. Final decision memo. Filed in Executive Office Records. Stamped classified. Presidential request noted. Decision access denied. Files remain classified. No timeline for future review. Reasoning redacted in preserved copies. Just black bars where explanation should be. 4 days before Dallas. When I found those response memos in the archives, I had to read them twice. 3 times. A president of the United States requested access to surveys of buildings constructed 80 years earlier, buildings that still stood, that housed post offices and courthouses that American citizens walked through daily conducting government business. Officials who worked for that president told him no. They recommended he not access documents about federal property he technically controlled as chief executive. They cited national security for surveys documenting architectural measurements from 1888, and he accepted that denial, or ran out of time to fight it. 4 days later, Dallas happened. The declassification request died with him. The question stopped being, what did those surveys document? The question became, what architectural data from 1888 requires national security protection in 1963? What could be in building measurements that a sitting president should not see? What information about structures Americans use daily cannot be made public even when president himself requests it? The files do not answer that. They just show he asked. Officials said no. Reasoning was classified. Buildings stayed restricted. And 4 days after final denial, JFK was dead. National Archives reading room. Present day. Afternoon. Quiet. Fluorescent lights humming. Building commission records spread across research table, construction dates, material specifications, contractor names, engineering reports from 1840s through 1880s, standard architectural documentation, How buildings in different regions were designed and constructed. Expected pattern would be variety, regional differences, local materials, local building traditions, local geology affecting foundation design, local climate affecting thermal requirements. Buildings in Massachusetts should differ from buildings in Louisiana. Granite versus brick, different foundation depths, different thermal mass requirements, different structural approaches for different conditions. Federal building construction followed local needs. Treasury Department sent specifications to regional offices. Local commissioners adapted designs for local conditions, hired local contractors familiar with local materials and methods. Standard practice. Buildings varied by location. That is what should appear in the records. I started mapping every building mentioned in the 1888 Survey Commission files. 847 locations, listed with coordinates rather than addresses. Geographic positions for structures the survey had tested. Plotted them on map of United States. Expected scatter pattern. Buildings spread across regions with no particular clustering. Random distribution matching federal property locations. That is not what the map showed. The buildings clustered, concentrated in specific regions. Not random at all. Patterns emerged. Boundaries became visible. Geographic distribution that matched something else entirely. I pulled historical maps from Library of Congress. Maps from 1830, before California Gold Rush, before major Western expansion, before Civil War remapped territorial boundaries. Those maps showed territorial labels that no longer appear on modern maps. Regions marked with names that disappeared from geography between 1840 and 1870. Areas labeled as territories connected to or influenced by something called Tartaria, a geographic designation that vanished during exactly the period when these federal buildings were constructed. Overlay the 1830 map showing those territorial labels with locations of buildings from the 1880 survey. The buildings cluster precisely in regions where those labels appeared. Regions that 1870 maps relabeled as simply state territories. The name Tartaria disappeared from American cartography between 1840 and 1865. Federal buildings showing anomalous properties were constructed between 1847 and 1879 during transition. While maps were changing, while territorial designations were being revised, while something was being relabeled or removed from official geography, every building in the survey list, construction date between 1847 and 1879, 32-year window, not buildings from 1700s, not buildings from early 1800s, not buildings from 1880s or 90s, specific period. Specific dates clustering around mid-century. Every building located in regions that 1830 maps labeled differently than 1870 maps. Regions where territorial designation changed, where geographic nomenclature was revised. Where something about how territory was described or categorized was altered in official cartography. Every building. Federal property, government ownership, post offices, courthouses, customs houses, land offices, federal administrative buildings, not private construction, not commercial property, not residential, government buildings constructed during specific period in specific regions, and every building, similar architectural features, copper domes, specific foundation depth requirements regardless of geology, complex ventilation systems exceeding building size requirements, acoustic properties specified in contracts, design elements consistent across different states, different architects, different construction companies, different commissioners. Buildings in Pennsylvania matched buildings in Illinois, matched buildings in Missouri, same copper element specifications, same foundation mandates, same ventilation geometry, same acoustic requirements. 12 states, different regions, different local conditions, identical specialized features. Then after 1880, the pattern breaks. Buildings constructed after 1880 in same regions using same general architectural style, different specifications, no copper element requirements. Foundation depths match local geology, standard ventilation, no acoustic specifications. The specialized features that appeared consistently from 1847 through 1879 simply disappear from federal building specifications after 1880, and buildings constructed after 1880 with standard specifications tested in the 1888 Survey Commission study, showed no unusual properties, no voltage generation, no electromagnetic field patterns, standard results, what you would expect from inert building materials. But buildings from 1847 through 1879 period, constructed in regions where map labels changed, using specifications that disappeared after 1880, all showed properties Victorian engineering did not predict. When I saw that pattern emerge across the maps and building records and survey data, the timing felt impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Specific historical period, specific geographic regions, specific architectural specifications, all correlating with buildings showing properties that required surveys to be classified for 75 years, 847 buildings, 32-year construction period, 12 states, all showing same electromagnetic properties, all built while maps were being revised, all constructed during transition when territorial designations changed, all using specifications that vanished from federal building requirements after 1880. The correlation is documented across multiple independent sources: historical maps, construction records, survey measurement data, specification documents, all correlating with pre-1880 federal construction in specific regions during specific period. The explanation for why that correlation exists is not documented anywhere in the archives. 7 categories of evidence, documented independently, filed in different archives, spanning different time periods, all available to researchers today, all correlating with same thing. First category, electromagnetic properties, voltage generation between copper building elements and earth ground, sustained electrical potential in structures constructed before electrical systems existed, measured in 1888, measured again in 1963 by MIT students, measured again in 2019 during Boston courthouse renovation. Same properties, same buildings, across 131 years of testing. Second category, geographic correlation. Buildings cluster in regions where 1830 maps show Tartarian territorial labels. Same regions where 1870 maps show only state names. The label disappeared. Buildings constructed during that transition. Not before, not after. During third category, temporal window. 847 buildings, all constructed between 1847 and 1879. 32-year period. Buildings before that date, different designs. Buildings after that date, different specifications. The window is specific. The boundaries are clear. Fourth category, architectural consistency. Copper element requirements identical across 12 states. Foundation depth mandates regardless of geology. Ventilation specifications exceeding building needs. Acoustic property requirements unusual for administrative structures. Same specifications from different architects, different contractors, different commissioners. Consistency across geographic distance that normally produced variation. Fifth category, measurement suppression. 1880 Survey Commission report classified immediately upon submission. No public announcement, no published findings, engineers reassigned. Results buried. 1963 MIT proposal approved by president, then cancelled after assassination. Research terminated. Students redirected. 2019 renovation survey detects properties, investigation request denied. Results omitted from final report. Pattern repeating across 131 years. Sixth category, research prevention. Every attempt to study these properties systematically blocked, funding denied, access revoked, proposals rejected. Scientists discouraged, students reassigned. Researchers encounter same resistance across generations, different institutions, different time periods. Same response. Seventh category, presidential denial. JFK requests declassification of survey data. Multiple agencies recommend denial. President cannot access surveys of buildings under his executive authority. Request denied 4 days before Dallas. Declassification dies with him. Files remain restricted across 6 subsequent administrations. 7 categories, different sources, different time periods. 1888 through 2019, all correlate with buildings constructed between 1847 and 1879 using specifications that disappeared after 1880. The measurements exist. Filed in National Archives, in MIT institutional records, in GSA project files, classified or restricted or simply not publicized, available to researchers who know where to look and what to request. Documentation showing properties buildings were not supposed to have according to Victorian engineering understanding or modern architectural theory. The specifications exist. Federal Building Requirements 1847 through 1870, 9 copper thickness tolerances. Foundation depth mandates, ventilation geometry, acoustic properties, requirements appearing consistently across different states and projects, then vanishing completely from specifications after 1880, the requirements that produced buildings with unusual properties, used for 32 years, then abandoned entirely. The suppression pattern exists. Surveys classified. Research blocked. Presidential access denied. MIT study cancelled. Modern investigation prevented. Across 131 years. Across different political administrations. Across different scientific institutions. Same response to same questions about same buildings. The geographic correlation exists. Maps showing Tartarian labels in 1830. Same regions relabeled by 1870. Buildings constructed during that transition showing properties other buildings do not show. Timing matching cartographic revision. The buildings exist, still standing, still in use, serving as post offices, courthouses, government offices. Americans walk through them daily. The copper elements remain in place. The properties those elements display, still measurable, still repeatable, still present after 140 to 176 years. What you have, measurements documented across 131 years, specifications used consistently for 32 years then abandoned, suppression pattern preventing investigation, geographic correlation with cartographic changes, presidential request denied, buildings still functioning, what you do not have, explanation for why buildings generate voltage, documentation of specification purpose, reason for immediate classification in 1888, justification for denying presidential access in 1963, answer to what those buildings were designed to do beyond housing government offices, mechanism behind properties Victorian engineering could not explain and modern engineering will not investigate. The correlation is there, the evidence is filed, the buildings stand. The explanations remain classified or simply absent from all available documentation. The documents remain. Filed across 3 archives. National Archives Acts ST in College Park holds the Survey Commission records. Record Group 64, Public Building Service. JFK Presidential Library in Boston holds the Executive Office files, the declassification request, the denial memos, the authorization for MIT study. MIT Institutional Archives hold the research proposal that was never completed. Requesting these documents is legal. Reading them is permitted. No special clearance required for most files, just standard researcher access. The surveys JFK wanted public, still classified, but the correspondence about those surveys, available. The architectural specifications, available. The building lists, available. You can visit Boston Federal Courthouse today. Walk through doors built in 1872. Stand in halls where MIT students detected electromagnetic fields in 1963. Same building engineers measured during 2019 renovation. Same copper dome, same granite foundation. Same structure that generated voltage 147 years ago. Still generates it now. 6.8 volts measured last year during equipment installation survey. The building is 152 years old. The properties persist. Federal building construction specifications from 1847 through 1879 exist in National Archives. Copper thickness requirements, foundation depth mandates, ventilation geometry specifications. Then 1880 arrives. New specifications, standard construction methods, the requirements that produced voltage-generating buildings used for 32 years, then never used again. JFK saw something in those 1888 surveys. Enough to request full declassification. Enough to authorize MIT comprehensive study. Enough to push against Interior Department resistance. He wanted the measurement data public. He wanted researchers to access what those buildings were designed to do. 10 days later, Dallas, November 22, 1963. The declassification request died with him. MIT study canceled December 3rd, 11 days after assassination. Buildings surveyed in 1888 stayed classified. Presidential authorization insufficient to protect research. His death made vulnerable. Why classify building measurements from 1888? What architectural data requires national security protection 75 years later? What information about structures Americans use daily cannot be made public even when a president requests it? Why build 847 federal buildings using identical specifications across 12 states during a 32-year period, then abandon those specifications completely after 1880? Why do buildings constructed during that specific period show electromagnetic properties buildings constructed before and after do not show? The buildings stand, post offices still deliver mail, courthouses still hold trials, government offices still serve citizens. They look ordinary. Classical revival architecture, granite facades, copper domes, historic landmarks, tourist attractions in some cities, but the copper still generates voltage after 140 to 176 years. The specifications that produced that voltage were used consistently, then abandoned entirely. The measurements documenting it were classified for 75 years, denied to a president, and restricted across 6 administrations since. The archives are open. The documents are there. The buildings function daily. JFK wanted the surveys public. Someone said no. That no has been maintained from Lyndon Johnson through Joe Biden. 9 presidents, 61 years, the restriction continues. What was built between 1847 and 1879 still stands, still generates measurable electrical potential, still serves government functions. What those buildings were designed to do beyond housing offices remains classified or undocumented. The request to make it public died in Dallas. The buildings did not.